tonight I'll ask permission from the Sangha and all of the lay people here to speak a little bit about the Dhamma. Today I had the chance to visit Venerable Ajahn Kemanando at Wimokaram over in Kalista. He lives there, usually there's 2 monks there, and the area where that hermitage is established is large forested area with large trees all around. Has a very cool atmosphere because it's a mountain and quite damp. So there's a nice, cool, peaceful atmosphere there. We visited him there today because he's a fellow monk practicing in the Buddhist religion, following the teachings. He's been there for the last 2 or 3 years. The place itself was started about 8 years ago. And in the Dhamma Vinaya, or the dispensation of the Buddha, the Dhamma, the truth, Vinaya, the discipline, we call such a place Sasana Sampati. It's a place for the practice of the teachings, or a religious place. And the Buddha praised monks, practitioners who find secluded places to practice, places away from large populations of people. But it's inevitable that monks, they have to be supported. They need the 4 requisites, so they can never be totally secluded. So over there they also have people coming to offer dana and come to practice meditation as well, once a week. So there's still some interaction with the community going on. The nature of practice in the Buddhist teachings is that we practice both for ourselves, the benefit of ourselves, and for the benefit of others. We do this together. And we have to study the world, get to know the world. You could say the world is a place that is made up of living beings, plants, and inanimate objects. And all the time in our lives we're mixing with these things. But really we're not involved with these things for very long. We're just here on this planet for a short space of time, short period of time, and then eventually we go, we leave it. And all of these things, ourselves and the things we mix with, they all return eventually to their original form. It's their nature to do that. They degenerate and they go back to the elements. So when we reflect and contemplate on this, we can see that in the ultimate sense, we don't own any of this world, any part of it. We don't own anything, material thing, mental thing. We don't own this body. We don't have what you might say a title deed to anything. Even though we say sometimes this is mine, this is me, I own this, I am this. Really we don't have any title deeds to anything. There's nothing that can stop the advance of time, the process of aging, and the ultimate process of degeneration and break-up of everything in this world. But because of the presence of ignorance and delusion in our hearts, in our minds, we're not free from the world. We become bound and attached to the world and the things of the world. And we tend, through our delusion, to think all the time that everything belongs to us. That this is mine, this is me, mine, I own this. But because these things are all bound to change, degenerate and break up, then that brings us a lot of suffering, a lot of dukkha, when we have that attachment, that delusion. Because nothing can last. And so when things do break up, we suffer. Because of our attachment, our sense of ownership, which is based on delusion. So we have to learn to observe and examine in this universe, learn to investigate it. But that doesn't mean necessarily we have to go out and look at every star out there in the sky. There's millions of stars and planets, more than we could ever know or count. But this world that we live in is part of the universe, and you could say it is the universe. In that sense, when we understand the world, then we can understand the whole universe. But to do this, we have to learn to investigate, to examine things. Just like, say, for instance, scientists, astronomers, or even astronauts, they do go out to examine and investigate the universe. Often they're trying to find places where there's similarities with our world, trying to find places where human beings might be able to go and live and spread the human race to these places. That's often their goal when they're studying. Or geologists, they examine the underground of this world, what's underneath the world, to try and find various resources and metals to help in the material development of the world, help humans to do things. In Buddhism, we're also examining, investigating things to find benefit, but we go in a slightly different direction. We go into the mind and into our experience. The way the Buddha described all this in his teachings, this was all done in Pali, the old ancient language of northern India that he used. But this, when we look at language, this is just a convention. Now the conventions have changed over time, so language has changed, as have many other things. Our customs, various social conditions and things have changed. But really, all of this, what we call convention, and language is a part of convention. This is all just external labels that we put onto things. Say, for instance, the experience of cold and hot that human beings have. Different cultures, countries, languages will have a different label for that. They'll have a different word for the experience of cold, or a different word for hot. But that's just language, that's convention, that's the apparent reality that we tend to attach to and use. But the actual feeling of heat or cold, the experience of it is the same, whatever the label, whether it's an ancient language, a modern language, the experience itself is just the same. So customs and languages might change, but what we know, what we can actually know and experience with our minds is the same. And the Buddha said, when we know things, we tend to know things often with delusion, with ignorance or a lack of understanding, rather than wisdom. And so this leads to a lot of doubt and uncertainty in our minds about the world. We don't yet really know the world. It can lead to a lot of confusion, and even we often are tending to guess about things, make guesses and try and kind of work things out in our mind, but we don't yet really know until we've really examined properly. You might compare this to, say, somebody who's blind. They have eyes, but their eyes aren't working properly, they're disabled. People describe colours to them. They say, this is white, this is yellow, this is blue. But they can't see, and they don't see anything but, say, darkness or a blur. So they're always going to doubt. They'll be uncertain about exactly what they're being told. They might even dispute that there are such things as colours. Or even someone with good eyes, who isn't disabled or blind. They have got good eyes, but the various conditions that lead to seeing are not fulfilled. So when one sees, one has to have a good, healthy eye. There has to be eye consciousness, and there has to be light for seeing to take place. But sometimes one of these conditions is not there. It might be the eye is not right, or even that there's not enough light. Say when there's not enough light, we can't see properly. And when you look at this, you can see, oh, well, even something like seeing is dependent on conditions. Or another example of this is when you talk about, say, a doctor who examines or investigates a patient who says they have some illness. He'll start out on the outside looking at the external symptoms. He might take a thermometer and measure their temperature. If it goes beyond a certain level, we say, oh, this is abnormal. If it goes high, we say, oh, this person has a fever. Maybe even say, oh, this is dangerous. And we use a thermometer to gauge this. We look at the conditions, the external conditions, and we start to draw conclusions. For one who is practicing the Dhamma, we also examine things, but we turn our attention inwards to examine the mind and the objects of the mind and the states of mind that we experience. Ajahn Chah said, when we want to know the world, then we have to look at the mind, examine it until we see truth, the truth of the way things are. If you do study truth in this way, by studying the mind and the objects of the mind, then you start to analyze and separate things out. You start to separate yourself or that part of the mind you're training to know things. You're separating that from the world. Because when you develop knowledge and wisdom, you're separating yourself from these mind states that we experience. And that separation from mind states is actually separating yourself from the world, or detaching yourself from the world. When we do this, it leads to peace, because the place where stress and suffering arises is in the mind that it has negative mind states, that takes hold of them, attaches to negative mind states. So when we examine carefully and start to separate and detach ourselves from the mind states, and particularly negative mind states, we start to experience peace coming from that detachment. The more we examine, the more we start to see these things, the more we detach, then the less suffering we have. This comes because when we do examine and investigate to see the truth, we start to see that which brings us harm. In order to see that which is harmful to us in the mind, we have to take good care of our minds, look after them very well, not to allow them to fall into desires that bring us to suffering and bring harm to us. So we start, by investigating, we start to see the danger of attachment, the danger of unwholesome desires, and the harm that these desires bring to us. And the more we investigate, and the more we see the danger and the harm that comes through desire and attachment, then the more careful we become. A good example of this is, say, anger. When we have desires with aversion or anger, when we examine that, when we examine the mind state of anger, we can see, it brings us harm. It brings us danger. Especially if we were to get angry with somebody very close to us. When we're examining and observing this, we can see that immediately all our happiness disappears straight away, or our sense of contentment disappears straight away, if we were to get angry to someone who we're very close to, completely goes from the mind. But actually even animals can see the harm of this. Say if you have a dog in your house or family, you look after a dog can't speak or communicate, but say you were to get angry or someone in your family gets angry, even a dog can see the anger in somebody and would become suspicious and afraid. And while that person is angry, they would start to see them more like an enemy. So the Buddha taught us to study the world by studying the mind and states of mind, and to learn to look after the mind and protect it to avoid harm coming to it. When we understand how to do this, we understand the world and we come to know the world. The way we practice is to extinguish suffering from the mind, and we do this by letting go of attachments which bind us to the world and cause us suffering. Not only do we study this mind, but we also study this body. When we start to study and examine this body, we see it in its true light in nature. We see that the body is made up of elements, the four elements: earth, air, fire and water. And just like those mind states, we see that these four elements are empty of self. When we start to see the lack of self in these four elements, we see that they're part of nature, then it brings us to see that these four elements are empty of self. When we see that the four elements are empty, then we can see that the whole world around us is also empty of self. When we start to see that by observing and reflecting, when we see that this body and these four elements are empty, then we see that they're not really worthy of desiring or attaching to. Because something that is empty is not worth seeking for, because there's nothing there, it's empty. So the way with the practice, contemplating in this way, it brings us to help us let go of desire and attachment, and this brings us to become more and more peaceful when we see things in this way. The effect of examining, observing truth like this about our minds and our bodies is it brings us to peace. Just like somebody who has been ill and then they take the right medicine and the symptoms start to abate, they feel a lot better, they feel at their ease after the symptoms go down. And the practice of mindfulness and wisdom, as I've already discussed many times, the practice of the four foundations of mindfulness, which I'm sure you all know well by now, this is the same. The result of it is like medicine. It makes us feel better. Our minds become peaceful. So when we study the truth, we're studying to see the way of the world and to see that it's a conditioned place. The nature of this world is that it's conditioned. One thing arises in dependence on another. One thing has an effect which causes other things to have results. When we contemplate and examine carefully to see truth, then we're observing this and we see that the three universal characteristics of impermanence, suffering and the lack of self are there in everything. Everything in the world has those three characteristics. And this contemplation and observing of the three characteristics in the world, it leads us to experience emptiness. We see emptiness in the world. All the Buddha Dhamma, the teachings of the Buddha, point us to this truth, the truth that sees emptiness in all things, all conditioned things. And only humans can really taste this. It's the highest Dhamma. this is what we call vimokkha, and liberation or freedom. And it's by careful examination of truth that it brings us to freedom, freedom from attachment, liberation from attachment. Sati, Santi, Buddha, Buddho. These are words that bring us great benefit. One can say to observe and know something, to be able to understand it so that one can tell or explain about it, and then know how to use it wisely, skillfully. If we are unable to examine and get to understand something, then it will always lead to doubt, uncertainty in our minds. We will never be sure about that thing. But if we have sati, mindful awareness, we are able to learn and observe all about different things. We use sati to examine the world, our lives, our minds, our bodies, and we get to know and understand these things. If we have sati, mindfulness, then the moods and the conditions of the world and the society around us will be unable to overwhelm us or take control of our minds. So sati and buddho, buddho means awakened awareness, gives us mindfulness and a sense of peace, coolness. For instance, when we have sense contact, when our eyes see a form, the presence of sati, santi, buddho, it keeps the mind cool and calm at that moment when there's sense contact. And this cool calmness gives us energy, brightness, keeps the mind stable, and it allows us to continue living with awareness. When we have to deal with the world on the material level, with mindfulness and awakened awareness, we deal with the world in the correct way. We understand that the world is made up of these four elements, earth, air, fire and water, and we look at them in the correct way, with the correct view, right view. We know that these four elements are subject to upata, titi and bangka, meaning they're subject to arising, they're sustained for a while, and then they pass away. So looking at the world, looking at these four elements with correct view is to see their impermanent nature. And when we can see that, then the world is unable to overwhelm us or take control of us, because we know that it's subject to arising and passing away. And the normal way of people who they will normally praise, the things that they normally praise and encourage us to attach to get involved with, these things won't be able to overwhelm us when we see impermanence in this way, when we have sati and we have an awakened awareness and wisdom. With the practice of sati, it helps us to bring us to restrain our senses when there is sense contact through the 6 sense doors. We have eyes, ears, nose, tongue, the body itself and the mind. It's a bit like having a gatekeeper. When we have mindfulness, then it's like we have a gatekeeper watching over these sense doors. I've been to see prisons in different countries, in New Zealand and the UK for instance, and when I visited those prisons to visit prisoners, give teachings, I observed how the ones on duty had to watch over the doors, the guards. They had to control everything, look after the keys, sign people in, sign them out. The guards have to check all the visitors to know who comes in, when, what time, the numbers of people, who they are, where they're from, whether they're here with good or bad intention. That's what a good guard or gatekeeper does. And sati, mindfulness, does this same job with our minds, with our senses. The practices we do as monks also give an example of this, how sati can be compared to sati, watching over the mind. As monks we have the 10 basic practices or kichavatas of a monk. Say, for instance, the first one is that we have to be responsible for our dwelling and the vihara that we live in. We have to know it very well, know the location, we have to know what's there, what's around, we have to know how to look after it and maintain it. And we have to check on everybody who comes to the vihara, we have to know who they are. And this is the second of the duties, akanduka wata. We have to know how to receive visitors in the proper way, people who come to our vihara. We have to check if they're coming with good or bad intention. We have to know them as they are. We have to take responsibility to look after visitors. We have to watch their behavior and get to know them. These are the sort of duties that monks have to do according to their rules, and it's similar to the practice of mindfulness. When visitors come to the vihara, the monastery, we have to attend to them. We have to look after them, because most of them bring with them suffering. They need to relieve themselves maybe, so we always have the duty to tell them where the toilets are, either show them or actually tell them where they are. We have to provide them with refreshment, at the very least water and drinks, and telling them where the facilities are located in the monastery. These are all the practices a monk has to perform, and they're just the same as mindfulness, which checks the senses, looks after the senses and the objects that come in contact with our senses. When we have mindfulness, then we are able to keep in touch with the mind at every moment of sense contact. We see that when there is sense contact, it can give rise to images and reactions in the mind. We can have different mental images, visual images come up in the mind. With every moment of contact, it can stimulate something, and we have to be aware of all that. We have to be aware of everything that arises in the mind through sense contact, and check and make sure that there are no blemishes in the mind, no unwholesome states arise because of this contact. We can't allow that to happen. If we can do this well, then that's a sign of maturity of practice. One who can watch over their mind, guard it carefully whenever there's sense contact, and avoid any unwholesome blemishes arising in the mind, we say that that person sees the danger of samsara, the endless round of birth and death. They know how to relate to samsara in the right way. They are somebody who's circumspect, responsible, and don't bring any harm to themselves or create suffering for themselves or others. When they're doing that, then they naturally become the object of respect with other people. They become somebody who is a friend to other people in the proper way, because they have no bias in their mind. When there's sati watching over the mind, protecting all the sense contact and protecting the mind, then one relates to all other people through Dhamma without bias, and starts to see everyone like a relative, because there's no anger or bias or attachment in the mind. This isn't displayed when one's practicing in this way. There's no bias displayed in one's actions, one's behavior, or even one's thinking. We see everyone as relatives because we see that they're subject to the same truth that we are. All of us are subject to the same truth, so on that level we're all related, we're all similar. From the very moment we're born into this world, we all have the same kind of experiences. Every baby that's born into the world comes in with an expression of pain, discomfort and suffering. All babies display that. They as soon as they're born, they start to cry, and you can see the suffering in their faces. We were all babies, so on that level we're all the same, all similar, and one who sees the truth understands this without bias. Everyone who is still experiencing dukkha, they're not free yet from their attachments, not free from the world. And until they've practiced and matured themselves, then they'll have to suffer. So again, on that level, we're all relatives, we're all the same. We're all subject to aging. This is another truth that we all have to experience and we can't escape from. We all have to age, we can't stop it. The aging process taking place. It's a certain thing, just as a river flows towards the sea, then we all flow towards old age. Or another comparison the Buddha made is like, they say the process of aging is like you have a cart made out of bamboo, and bamboo is not very strong, so that cart, the more you use it, is bound to fall apart, to get rickety and fall apart. It can't give you a smooth ride. This body of ours is just the same, because it's subject to aging. It won't be able to give us a smooth ride. The longer we live in the world, then everything starts to hurt. Our eyes go, our teeth falls out, we get aches and pains and all kinds of problems. And in the end we have to separate from this body and from each other, from all the material things in this world. Nothing is permanent. So the wise practitioner views all this and sees the world without bias, sees other people without bias, because they know that the inherent nature of everyone is the same. They're subject to the same truths. And this practice, coming to see that, to have that realization, is the most useful, beneficial thing we can do for the world, because it brings true peace to the heart. And with that peace, the heart contains metta, kindness and compassion. When one has perfected this way of practice, developed their mind to the full, develop what we call tata bodhisattva, then there is just peacefulness and wisdom left, kindness and compassion. So we develop this practice by developing sati, awareness, santi, peace, and buddho, awakened knowledge. We're studying and practicing in this way not to give rise to more worries and doubts about things, but to actually bring these things up for ourselves, to realize them in our minds. The more we practice, the more we'll experience the cool happiness that comes through as a result of practice. And this is really the most important thing that we can do. It's the only way to really raise our minds to a higher level in this life and to really perfect ourselves and realize our potential as human beings. And we do this for our own benefit and for the benefit of everyone.